My brother stole my girlfriend. Now he's broke, alone, and facing jail while I got everything. Hello, read it. There are moments in life when everything you know shifts, when the foundation you've stood on for years suddenly crumbles beneath you, leaving you gasping for something, anything to hold on to. Sometimes that shift comes slowly, creeping up so subtly that you don't recognize it until it's too late. Other times, it happens in an instant, a sharp and brutal realization that changes everything. For me, the shift had been gradual, but by the time I finally saw the truth, it was already too late. My name is Caleb, and at 25, I had never once considered the idea that my family, the people who were supposed to stand by me no matter what, could become the source of my greatest betrayal. Looking back, the signs had been there all along, woven into the years of my life like invisible cracks in glass, waiting for just the right moment to shatter. My father was a man of principle, strict but fair, the kind of man who valued honesty, loyalty, and hard work above all else. He had grown up with nothing and built everything he had from the ground up. He never handed us anything we didn't earn, and while that made things tough at times, I respected him for it. My mother, on the other hand, was softer in some ways, but selective with her affections. She had a way of making you feel like the sun when you had her approval, and completely invisible when you didn't. And then there was my older brother, Jordan. Jordan had always been the golden child. He was effortlessly charming, the kind of person who could talk his way out of anything, and he had a way of making people believe in him, even when they shouldn't. He wasn't malicious, at least not in an obvious way, but he knew how to manipulate a situation to his advantage. Where I had spent my life earning every opportunity, Jordan had always found a way to cut corners and still come out ahead. And no matter how many times he messed up, our mother was always there to defend him. Smoothing things over like his failures were nothing more than minor inconveniences. Despite all that, I had never resented him. Maybe I should have. But growing up, it was hard to hate someone who never saw you as competition. Jordan never saw me as a threat, and in some twisted way, I think that made him feel like we were on the same side. He had always treated me like his little brother, even when I surpassed him in school, even when I made better choices. To him, I was just Caleb, the responsible one, the steady one, the one who never rocked the boat. And because I never got in his way, he never saw a reason to go after me. At least, not at first. I had spent my early 20s building my future, working through college, balancing multiple jobs, making sure I set myself up for a life that no one could take away from me. I wasn't the kind of person who expected handouts, and I had never asked my parents for help beyond what was necessary. I worked my way into a stable job, saved every dollar I could, and had a plan for what came next. Stability was something I craved, and for a long time, I thought I was on the right path. And for a while, it felt like everything was falling into place. I had a girlfriend, Madison, who I truly believed I would spend my life with. We had met in college, one of those easy relationships that didn't need grand gestures or endless drama to feel real. She was smart, kind, and ambitious in a way that made me feel like we were building something together. I loved her, and I had assumed she loved me too. We had been together for years, long enough that I had started to imagine the future, a home, a life, maybe even a family of our own someday. Jordan, of course, had a different kind of life. He was the kind of guy who drifted from one opportunity to the next, chasing quick money, chasing women, chasing the idea that he could have everything without ever really working for it. He had jobs here and there, but nothing that lasted. He dated women who worshipped him until he got bored and moved on. My father had long since lost patience with him, but my mother continued to shield him, excusing every failure, every mistake. And for the most part, I stayed out of it. Jordan and I weren't particularly close anymore, but we weren't enemies either. We had an unspoken agreement. We lived our separate lives, and as long as we didn't get in each other's way, there was no reason for tension. But things started to change. Looking back, I should have noticed the small shifts. Madison's phone always just out of reach when I walked into the room. The way she started spending more time out with friends but never mentioned names. The way Jordan would glance at her just a second too long when he thought I wasn't looking. At the time, I told myself I was imagining things. Madison and Jordan had never been particularly close, and Jordan had never shown any real interest in my life before. I had no reason to believe there was anything going on. But trust is a funny thing. It's not something that shatters all at once. It cracks bit by bit until suddenly you're left staring at the pieces, wondering how you never saw it breaking before. The night I finally saw those cracks was like any other. I had just finished a long shift at work and was planning on heading straight home. But at the last minute, I decided to stop by my parents' house. It was late, but the lights were still on. My father had gone to bed, but my mother and Jordan were in the kitchen, deep in conversation. They hadn't noticed me at first, and I was about to announce myself when I heard my name. I should have walked away. I should have never stayed to listen. But I did, and what I heard made my stomach turn to ice. It wasn't about money or school or family obligations. It wasn't the kind of casual gossip that meant nothing. They were talking about me and Madison, and Jordan wasn't talking like a brother. He was talking like a man who had already taken something that didn't belong to him. The realization didn't hit all at once. At first, my brain rejected it, struggling to make sense of the words, the tone, the way my mother wasn't even surprised. And then as I stood there, heart pounding, I finally understood. The betrayal had already happened. I just hadn't caught up to it yet. The words I heard that night stayed with me like a poison, spreading slowly, making me question everything. I didn't react right away. I couldn't. Instead, I stood in the shadows of my parents' house, listening, heart pounding, as my mother and Jordan talked about me, my relationship, and the secrets they had been keeping. I should have walked in and confronted them. I should have demanded answers right then and there. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the deep, gut-wrenching fear that once I heard everything, there would be no going back. Maybe it was the quiet, sick realization that my mother wasn't even shocked by what Jordan was saying. She wasn't arguing, wasn't calling him out. She already knew. I left without a sound, walking out of that house like a ghost, my mind spiraling with half-formed thoughts and memories that suddenly felt different in hindsight. I drove home in silence, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, but I didn't remember the trip. My mind was too busy replaying everything, trying to piece together the signs I had ignored, the moments that should have made me ask questions. And suddenly, the things that had once felt small, the odd glances, the brief moments of tension, began to sharpen in my mind. The way Madison had started being less affectionate, pulling away when I reached for her hand. The way she always seemed to have a reason to be out later than usual. The way Jordan had been more present, casually inserting himself into our plans, in conversations, in places he had never bothered to be before. And my mother, her subtle encouragement of Jordan, the way she always found a way to excuse his behavior, even when it clearly crossed a line. They had been keeping something from me. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling like my entire life had been rewritten behind my back. Every memory of my relationship with Madison now carried an ugly undertone, a sickening doubt that made me wonder if any of it had ever been real. Had she ever truly loved me? Or had she just been waiting for something better to come along? The next day, I forced myself to go to work as usual, but the hours dragged by in a haze. I could barely focus, my stomach twisted into knots. I needed answers, but I couldn't just ask outright. Not without proof. I wasn't going to let them gaslight me, tell me I was imagining things, make me feel like I was the crazy one. No, if I was going to confront them, I needed to be sure. So I started watching. I paid attention in ways I never had before. I watched how Madison checked her phone when she thought I wasn't looking, how she never left it face up on the table anymore. I watched how Jordan acted when we were all in the same room, how he seemed a little too comfortable, a little too familiar with her in ways I had never noticed before. It wasn't obvious, not yet, but the more I looked, the more the cracks started to show. That weekend, I told Madison I had to work late, but I didn't. Instead, I parked my car a few blocks away from our apartment and waited. My heart was pounding, my mind screaming at me that I was being paranoid, that I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. And I was right. 2 hours later, Jordan showed up. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my fingers ached, watching as my brother walked right into my apartment like he had every right to be there. There was no hesitation, no knocking, no waiting, just complete confidence. I don't remember how long I sat there. Maybe it was minutes. Maybe it was an hour. All I remember is the way my hands shook, the way my mind fractured, the way my stomach churned with a sickness I had never felt before. I had been so blind. I had spent years believing in people who had never deserved it. I had trusted Madison. I had trusted Jordan. And now it was all a lie. By the time I finally forced myself to move, I wasn't thinking clearly. I was running on instinct, on rage, on the need to do something before I lost my mind. I walked straight up to the door, my pulse roaring in my ears, and pushed it open without knocking. And the second I stepped inside, everything changed. Madison's face went pale when she saw me. Guilt, shock, fear. Jordan, on the other hand, had the audacity to smirk, like this was just another game to him, another one of his reckless stunts that he thought he could walk away from. I didn't yell. I didn't throw punches. I didn't need to, because the silence, the heavy, suffocating silence, said everything that needed to be said. Madison stammered, searching for an excuse, for some pathetic lie that might soften the blow. Jordan just watched me, waiting, as if daring me to react. But I didn't give them the satisfaction. I turned around and walked out, leaving them standing there with the wreckage of what they had done. I didn't go back to the apartment. I couldn't. Instead, I drove aimlessly for hours, trying to process what had just happened, try to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do next. And then, at some point in the night, I found myself in front of my father's house. He was awake when I knocked, as if he had been expecting me. One look at my face, and he didn't ask questions. He just stepped aside and let me in. I sat down at the kitchen table, feeling like I was coming apart at the seams. And when I finally spoke, my voice was hollow. I told him everything. My father listened in silence, his expression unreadable, his hands folded on the table in front of him. And when I was finished, he sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly, as if he had just been waiting for this moment. And then, for the first time in my life, I saw something in his eyes that I had never seen before. Not disappointment, not frustration, rage. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The silence between my father and me stretched on for what felt like an eternity. The weight of everything I had just told him hung heavy in the air, suffocating, raw, impossible to ignore. He sat at the kitchen table, his jaw tight, his fingers steepled together, staring at nothing. The usual sharpness in his eyes was replaced by something colder, something darker. I had seen my father angry before. He wasn't the type to yell or explode, but when he was disappointed, when he was truly furious, he didn't need to raise his voice. His silence spoke louder than words, and right now he was furious. He didn't ask how I felt. He didn't offer empty reassurances or tell me everything would be okay. He simply sat there, absorbing it all, as if he was turning over each piece of information, calculating the next move like a general preparing for battle. Then finally he spoke. He didn't ask for confirmation. He didn't need to. The way I had walked into his house, the look in my eyes, it was enough. I expected him to be disappointed in Jordan. I expected him to be disgusted by Madison. But what I hadn't expected was the depth of his rage. This wasn't just about my pain. This was about betrayal on a deeper level, about what it meant for the family, about what it said about the people he had spent his life providing for. My father had never respected Jordan. He had tolerated him, supported him, even given him second chances when he didn't deserve them. But he had never seen him as an equal. And now Jordan had proven him right. The conversation didn't last long. My father didn't need time to process or consider the implications. He had already made up his mind. Jordan was done. Madison was dead to him. And as for my mother, I could already tell that something inside him had shifted, that whatever faith he had left in her had just cracked beyond repair. I stayed at my father's house that night. He didn't ask if I wanted to go back to my apartment. He knew I wouldn't. He didn't push for conversation. He just let me sit in silence, let me exist in the aftermath of what had happened. And for the first time since I had discovered the truth, I felt safe. But the next morning, everything escalated. It started with the phone calls. My mother tried first. I ignored her. Then Jordan. Then Madison. None of them left voicemails. They didn't need to. I knew exactly what they wanted. They wanted to explain, justify, control the damage before it got worse. But I wasn't going to give them that chance. By noon, the news had spread. My father had made sure of that. He wasn't one to gossip, but he wasn't going to protect Jordan or my mother either. He had spent years shielding them from the consequences of their actions, but not anymore. The story traveled fast, through family, through old friends, through people who had once respected Jordan and Madison. And the more people found out, the more their carefully crafted reputations began to collapse. Jordan didn't take it well. He showed up at my father's house later that afternoon, his car pulling into the driveway too fast, his footsteps too loud, his body language screaming frustration and desperation. My father had been waiting for this moment. He didn't even look surprised when Jordan stormed in, fists clenched, eyes wild with panic disguised as anger. Jordan wasn't sorry. He wasn't even pretending to be. He was angry that he got caught. I sat in the corner of the room, watching as he paced back and forth, his voice rising with every word, demanding to know why my father had turned on him so quickly, why he was blowing this out of proportion. He had always believed that no matter what he did, our parents would always back him. And for the most part, he had been right. But this time he had gone too far. My father let him rant. He let him spill every excuse, every twisted version of the truth. And when he was finished, my father simply stood up, towering over him, and told him the words that finally broke him. Jordan was no longer his son. The house? No longer his to visit. The money my father had once set aside for him? Gone. Every connection, every resource, every lifeline that had once cushioned Jordan's reckless life? Gone. My father wasn't going to enable him anymore. And for the first time in his life, Jordan was truly alone. I could see the moment it sank in, the way his face twisted, the way his breath hitched. He hadn't expected this. He had expected my father to be mad, sure, but not this. Not to be cut off completely. But the moment passed, and the rage returned. He lashed out, throwing accusations, calling me pathetic, calling my father a bitter old man who never knew how to support his own family. He tried to act like he was the victim, like we were overreacting. But none of it mattered. Jordan left that day with nothing. I thought that was the end of it. I thought the damage had been contained, that Jordan and Madison would slink away and deal with the consequences of what they had done. But I was wrong, because 2 weeks later, I got an invitation in the mail. An invitation to Jordan and Madison's engagement party. At first, I thought it was a joke, some cruel, twisted attempt to get under my skin. But then I saw the guest list. It wasn't just family. It was everyone, our extended relatives, old family friends, even some of my father's closest business associates. It was a statement, a public declaration that they had won, that they had no shame, that they weren't just moving forward. They were celebrating it. And just like that, I knew this wasn't over yet. Because if they wanted to act like nothing had happened, if they wanted to put on a show for the world, then they had no idea what was coming. The invitation sat on my desk for days, unopened, a silent challenge that I refused to acknowledge. I should have thrown it away. I should have let it rot where it lay, ignored it as easily as Jordan and Madison had ignored the wreckage they left behind. But I couldn't. The more I tried to put it out of my mind, the more it dug into me, taunting me with the audacity of it all. They weren't just moving on. They were celebrating it, celebrating what they had done, acting as if their betrayal was nothing more than a stepping stone to a perfect future. And that was when I made my decision. I was going to the party, not for closure, not for some weak attempt at reconciliation, and certainly not because I wanted to see them. I was going because they needed to understand something. They had no idea what was coming. The engagement party was exactly what I expected. Over the top, indulgent, excessive in every possible way. The venue was extravagant, a high-end ballroom with towering floral arrangements, a live string quartet, and a sea of guests dressed in the finest attire. It was clear this wasn't just a gathering for family. This was an event, a spectacle designed to prove something. Jordan had always been about appearances, and this was no different. He wanted the world to see that he had won, that he had taken everything from me and walked away unscathed. The moment I walked in, I felt the shift. Conversations paused. People turned to look. Some whispers were hushed, others bold enough that I caught fragments of words. No one had expected me to come, And that was exactly why I was here. My eyes swept the room until they landed on them. Jordan and Madison stood at the center of it all, surrounded by admirers, glowing under the warm, golden light of the chandeliers. They looked untouchable, like the king and queen of their own perfect world. Jordan was in his element, laughing too loudly, his arm possessively wrapped around Madison's waist. And Madison, who had once been my future, now nothing more than a stranger draped in luxury, stood beside him, smiling like she belonged there. Her eyes met mine, and for just a moment the mask slipped. The smile faltered. The color drained slightly from her face. Jordan noticed, followed her gaze, and then his expression shifted into something smug, something taunting. He raised his glass slightly in my direction, as if toasting his own victory, as if to say, "Look at me. Look at what I have. Look at what you lost." He thought he had won. He thought this night was his victory lap. But he had no idea that this was the moment everything would come crashing down. Because I wasn't the only one who had come tonight. From the corner of the room, near the back, I saw him, our father. He stood with a drink in his hand, his expression unreadable, his presence unmistakable. He hadn't told me he was coming, but I should have known. My father didn't walk into battles unarmed, and tonight was a battlefield. I didn't approach him. I didn't need to. I simply waited. And then, as if sensing that the time had come, he made his move. The room quieted as my father stepped forward, his presence commanding attention without a single word. Conversations trailed off. People turned to watch, sensing the shift in the air, the unspoken tension weaving through the crowd like an invisible force. Jordan noticed too. His smirk twitched slightly, the bravado wavering just enough to reveal something deeper, something uncertain. Then in front of everyone, my father spoke. He didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice. But every word cut like a blade. Jordan was no longer his son. It was a declaration, an unshakable truth laid bare for all to hear. My father spoke of loyalty, honor, family, and betrayal. He told the room exactly what Jordan had done, how he had taken from his own blood, how he had discarded trust like it was nothing, how he had proven that he was not a man worthy of carrying our family's name. And then he delivered the final blow. This all had been changed. Everything, the estate, the properties, the business, the wealth, was being passed to me. Jordan was getting nothing. No inheritance. No safety net. No last-minute redemption. The room froze. I could hear the collective gasp ripple through the crowd, the weight of the words settling over them like a heavy storm cloud. I didn't need to look at Jordan to know what his face looked like. I already knew. Rage. Fear. But the best part? The part that made every second of this worth it? Madison. She had gone pale, her carefully composed facade cracking under the realization of what had just happened. She hadn't expected this. She had believed in Jordan's security, in the idea that he would always have something to fall back on. But now she understood. She had bet on the wrong man. Jordan turned to my father, desperate now, scrambling to salvage what he could. He tried to spin it, tried to act like this was some cruel overreaction, some emotional outburst that would eventually fade. But my father was done. The man who had bailed him out of trouble time and time again had finally reached his limit. And Jordan knew it. Then, just when I thought the night had reached its peak, my father turned, not to Jordan this time, but to my mother. His expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened, because this wasn't just about Jordan. This was about her, about the choices she had made. He didn't divorce her that night, but he made one thing clear. She had lost his respect. She had chosen Jordan over the family. She had defended him, protected him, shielded him from consequences that he should have faced years ago. And now, she would have to live with the consequences of her own choices. The silence in the room was suffocating. Jordan was speechless. Madison was trapped. My mother was stunned into stillness. And as for me, I turned and walked out, stepping into the cool night air, letting the weight of it all settle in my chest. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something new. Relief. They had tried to ruin me. They had taken everything they could. But in the end, I was the one who had won. And Jordan and Madison? They were left with nothing but each other. And I couldn't think of a more fitting punishment than that. I thought that night at the engagement party would be the last time I had to think about Jordan and Madison. Walking away from that disaster, from the wreckage they had made of their own lives, I felt lighter than I had in months. My father's words had sealed their fate in front of everyone. Jordan had been disowned, stripped of everything he thought he was entitled to, exposed as the failure he had always been. Madison had stood beside him, pale and shaking, realizing that the security she had counted on was gone. And my mother, well, she had been forced to face the truth. She had spent her life protecting a son who had never deserved it, and now she was left with nothing but regret. I should have been satisfied. I should have been able to move on. But fate wasn't done with them yet, and neither was karma. 2 months passed. I settled into my new life, free of their shadows. My father and I spoke more often, not as a father and son bound by obligation, but as two men who had survived the same war. He had started rethinking everything, reevaluating the family he had spent years holding together. He wasn't bitter. He was simply done. Jordan was dead to him. My mother barely more than an afterthought. I knew it hurt him, even if he didn't say it outright. But in the end, even he understood that sometimes blood doesn't make you family. Then one day I got a call, not from my father, not from my mother, from Madison. I stared at the screen, feeling a mix of disgust and curiosity coil inside me. I almost ignored it, almost let it ring out, but at the last second I picked up. I wanted to hear what she could possibly have to say. Her voice was different. Gone was the usual sweet, careful tone she used when she wanted to manipulate me. Instead, she sounded desperate. She told me she had made a mistake, that she had been blinded by promises, by Jordan's charm, by the illusion that he was something more than what he was. She said the engagement party had been a lie, a performance put on to convince the world, and themselves, that they weren't falling apart. But the truth? Jordan was crashing. Without my father's financial backing, without the inheritance he had always assumed he would get, Jordan had been left scrambling. He had tried to hold on to the lifestyle he was used to, the expensive dinners, the flashy car, the high-end apartment. But reality had caught up with him fast. The money was running out. The people who had once flocked to him for his status had stopped answering his calls. And Madison, well, she had realized too late that she had attached herself to a sinking ship. I could hear it in her voice. The regret, the panic, the realization that she had traded a future with stability, loyalty, and real love for a man who had nothing left to offer. And then she said something that almost made me laugh. She wanted to see me, not to fix things, not to apologize, but because she was scared. Jordan had changed. The pressure was getting to him. The loss of power had turned him into something unstable. He was drinking more, lashing out, becoming cruel in ways even she hadn't expected. And now, she was looking for an escape. I let her talk. I let her pour out every regret, every bad decision, every miserable moment she had endured since that party. And when she finally stopped, when she finally asked if we could meet, if she could talk things through with me, I smiled. And I hung up the phone, because some people don't deserve second chances. Madison had made her choice. Jordan had made his. And now, they would have to live with it. But the best part? This wasn't even the final blow, because karma had one last trick up its sleeve. A few weeks later, news started circulating. Jordan had been arrested. Apparently, his downward spiral had only gotten worse. Desperate for money, desperate to regain some kind of control, he had gotten involved in something illegal, something messy, something that finally caught up with him. A fraud scheme, a failed business venture, whatever it was, it had ended with him in handcuffs. The irony was delicious. Jordan had spent his entire life believing he was untouchable, that no matter how badly he screwed up, there would always be someone there to clean up his mess. First it was our mother, then it was my father, and for a time, even Madison had played that role, feeding into his delusions, standing beside him while he burned every bridge. But now, there was no one left, no father to bail him out, no family name to shield him, no wealthy inheritance to pay his way out of trouble. And Madison? She had vanished. The moment she realized Jordan was truly done, she had disappeared from his life. She hadn't waited for the trial. She hadn't stuck around to be the devoted fiancée in his time of crisis. She had been with him for what he could give her, and now that he had nothing, she was gone. It was poetic. They had betrayed me together, and in the end, they had destroyed each other. I stood outside my father's house the day I heard the news, breathing in the crisp evening air, letting the last remnants of that part of my life fade away. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't bitter. I was just free. For the first time in years, I wasn't looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next betrayal. I wasn't carrying the weight of a family that had never truly been whole. I had won, not just in the way Jordan had once thought winning meant, not through wealth, not through status, not through some childish competition. I had won because I had let them go. And as for Jordan and Madison, they were exactly where they had always been destined to end up, at the bottom. And I never looked back.